Data you can trust. Opening the question nobody asks. Here is a question that almost never comes up in a security conversation, and that is exactly why it matters. You have just received a file. It is encrypted, so nobody could have read it in transit. It arrived over a secure channel, so nobody could have intercepted it without detection, or so you assume. The question is this: how do you know it says what it originally said? Encryption answers a different question. Encryption answers, can someone read this? It does not answer, can someone change this? Those two questions feel like they should have the same answer, and for a long time, a lot of very smart engineers built systems as if they did. They didn't. A message can be completely unreadable to an attacker and still be successfully altered by that same attacker in ways that produce a result the attacker wants and the legitimate recipient cannot detect, unless something else is checking. That something else is integrity. Confidentiality keeps secrets secret. Integrity keeps facts factual. And the gap between those two ideas is where some of the most consequential security failures in history have lived, because organizations spent their budget and their attention on the first one and assumed the second one came along for free. This session is about that gap, about what integrity actually means beneath the one-word definition, about the tools that close the gap, about what happens when those tools are missing or misconfigured, and about how a single bit flipped in transit can move real money out of a real bank account if nobody is watching for exactly that. The foundation, what it means for data to be true. Let's start with the framework you already know, because the interesting part is what gets skipped when people recite it quickly. The CIA triad gives us confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is about who can see something. Availability is about whether something is there when you need it. Integrity sits between those two, and it answers a quieter but equally fundamental question. Is this the same thing it was before? Formally, integrity means that data has not been altered or destroyed in an unauthorized manner. Notice the word unauthorized doing real work in that sentence. Data changes all the time, legitimately. A database record gets updated. A configuration file gets edited by an administrator. A log file gets appended to. None of that is an integrity violation because it's authorized and it's expected. An integrity violation is a change that should not have happened, made by someone or something that should not have made it, or a change that happened by accident through corruption, hardware failure, or a bug that nobody intended and nobody knows about. That second category is worth sitting with for a moment because it's the one people forget. Integrity isn't only about attackers. A failing disk controller that silently flips a bit during a write operation is an integrity problem. A network transmission error that corrupts a packet in a way the lower layer checksums miss is an integrity problem. A buggy ETL script that truncates a field is an integrity problem. The attacker is the dramatic case. The bit rot, the silent corruption, the malformed pipeline output, those are the everyday case, and they are why integrity controls matter even in environments where nobody is actively trying to attack you. So how do you actually check whether data is the same? You can't compare every byte of every file against some master copy every time you touch it. That doesn't scale, and it doesn't even make sense for data in transit. What you need is a way to take a piece of data, no matter how large, and produce a small, fixed-size fingerprint of it, such that if even one bit of the original data changes, the fingerprint changes too, in a way that's effectively impossible to predict or fake. That's a hash function. Feed it any input, a single word or a 10-gigabyte file, and it produces a fixed-length output, called a hash or a digest. SHA-256, for example, always produces a 256-bit output regardless of input size. A strong cryptographic hash function has three properties that matter enormously here. The first is that it's deterministic. The same input always produces the same output every time on every machine. The second is that it exhibits what's sometimes called the avalanche effect, meaning a tiny change to the input, even flipping a single bit, produces a wildly different, unpredictable output, not a slightly different one. The third is collision resistance, meaning it should be computationally infeasible to find two different inputs that produce the same hash output. That third property deserves its own moment, because a collision is, in a very real sense, a failure of integrity at the algorithmic level. If two different files can produce the same hash, then the hash can no longer prove that a file is what it claims to be, because an attacker could potentially craft a malicious file that has the same fingerprint as a legitimate one. This is exactly what happened to MD5 and later to SHA-1. Both were widely used hashing algorithms. Both were eventually shown to be vulnerable to practical collision attacks, and both are now considered unsuitable for security purposes precisely because the guarantee that made them useful, that two different inputs couldn't produce the same output, was broken. This is why, when you see a recommendation to use SHA-256 or higher, that's not an arbitrary preference. It's a statement about which hash functions still provide the collision resistance that integrity guarantees depend on. Now here's where it gets interesting, and where the central tension of this whole session starts to come into focus. A hash tells you whether data has changed. It does not tell you who changed it, or whether the change was authorized, or even whether the hash itself can be trusted. If an attacker can modify both the data and the hash that's supposed to verify it, the hash is worthless. It'll match perfectly, because the attacker recalculated it to match their tampered version. A plain hash protects against accidental corruption beautifully. It does almost nothing against a deliberate, capable attacker, because that attacker can simply update the fingerprint along with the data. This is the foundational tension of integrity as a discipline. Detecting that something changed is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to know whether the entity asserting this is unchanged can be trusted, and that requires bringing in something the attacker doesn't have. That something is usually a secret. The structural tension, detecting change versus trusting the detector. Let's make this tension concrete with the scenario that anchors this entire session, because it's the cleanest illustration of why encrypted and intact are not the same word. Imagine a wire transfer system at a bank. The connection between the sending bank and the receiving bank is encrypted, end-to-end, using strong transport encryption. An attacker sitting on the network path cannot read the contents of the message. They cannot see the account numbers, the amount, any of it. From a confidentiality standpoint, this system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But encryption by itself doesn't guarantee that the ciphertext can't be manipulated. Depending on the specific encryption mode in use, certain cryptographic constructions are vulnerable to what's called a bit flipping attack. The attacker doesn't need to decrypt the message to understand it. They need to know or guess which bits in the ciphertext correspond to which parts of the plaintext, often based on the structure and position of fields in a known message format. Flip the right bits in the ciphertext, and when the receiver decrypts it, the plaintext comes out different, in a predictable way, without the attacker ever having read the original content. So the attacker flips some bits. The transfer amount, which was $100, decrypts on the receiving end as $900. The attacker has never seen the number 100 or the number 900. They don't need to. They just need to know this region of the ciphertext encodes a numeric amount field and apply a transformation that, after decryption, increases that number. The message is still fully encrypted the entire time. Confidentiality was never broken. And $800 just got created out of nothing, headed toward an account the attacker controls. This is the moment where the CIA triad stops being three independent boxes to check and becomes three properties that can each be intact while the other fails catastrophically. Confidentiality. Intact, nobody read anything they shouldn't have. Availability. Intact, the message arrived, the system processed it, nothing crashed. Integrity, completely violated, and nothing in the confidentiality or availability story would ever tell you that. This is why integrity needs its own dedicated control, one that doesn't rely on encryption to do a job encryption was never designed to do. That control is the hash-based message authentication code, or HMAC. An HMAC combines a hash function with a secret key shared between the sender and receiver. The sender takes the message, combines it with the secret key in a specific cryptographic construction, and produces a hash, the HMAC value. This HMAC is sent along with the message, either alongside the encrypted payload or itself encrypted. When the receiver gets the message, they decrypt it, then independently recompute the HMAC using the same secret key and the same algorithm on the data they received. If their recomputed HMAC matches the one that was sent, the data is exactly what the sender sent, and it was sent by someone who possesses the shared secret. If it doesn't match, even by 1 bit's worth of difference in the underlying data, the HMAC will be completely different, and the receiver knows with cryptographic confidence that something changed between sending and receiving. Go back to the bit flipping attack. The attacker flips bits in the ciphertext to turn $100 into $900. They have no way to also correctly update the HMAC, because computing a valid HMAC requires the secret key, which the attacker does not have. When the receiving system decrypts the message and recomputes the HMAC over the tampered $900 amount, the result will not match the HMAC that was transmitted, because that HMAC was computed by the legitimate sender over the original $100 message. Mismatch detected. Transaction rejected. Alert fires. This is the resolution to the tension, but notice it's not a free resolution. The HMAC didn't prevent the attacker from flipping the bits. The attacker still succeeded in manipulating the ciphertext. What the HMAC did was ensure that the manipulation was detected before any consequence occurred. The transaction never completed, no money moved. Integrity, in practice, is very often not about preventing tampering. It's about making tampering detectable reliably before it matters. That's a different posture than stop the attacker, and it's an important one to internalize, because a lot of integrity controls in the real world are detective, not preventive. They don't build a wall. They build a tripwire, and the value of the tripwire depends entirely on what happens after it trips. Which raises the next question, and it's the one that separates a checkbox implementation from a real one. What if the secret key itself is weak, stale, or compromised? The architecture of trust, where integrity lives in a system. If integrity is fundamentally about, can this be trusted to be unchanged? And is the detector itself trustworthy? Then building integrity into a system means answering that question at every layer where data exists, moves, or rests, and recognizing that each layer has a different threat model. At the data in transit layer, the bank wire transfer example is the canonical case. HMACs, or more broadly, message authentication codes, protect data as it moves across a network. The architectural decision here isn't just add an HMAC. It's about key management. The secret key used to compute the HMAC needs to be provisioned to both parties securely. It needs to be rotated on a schedule, because the longer a key lives, the more opportunity exists for it to leak. And the rotation process itself needs to be designed so that messages in flight during a key rotation don't get rejected due to a key mismatch between sender and receiver. A wire transfer system that rotates its HMAC secret monthly as a baseline practice is making an explicit trade-off. Slightly more operational complexity around key distribution, in exchange for a much smaller window during which a compromised key could be used to forge valid-looking HMACs on tampered messages. At the data at rest layer, the concern shifts from "did this change in transit?" to "has this stored object been silently modified since it was written?" This is where File Integrity Monitoring, FIM, lives. FIM tools establish a cryptographic baseline, essentially a hash, of critical files, system binaries, configuration files, anything where an unexpected change is itself the signal of compromise. The tool then periodically or continuously recomputes hashes of those files and compares them against the baseline. A mismatch means the file changed, and because these are files that shouldn't change outside of a controlled patch or configuration management process, an unexpected change is a strong indicator that something or someone modified the system outside of authorized channels. At the database layer, integrity takes on a structural meaning that's easy to overlook because it doesn't involve cryptography at all. Referential integrity, enforced through database constraints, ensures that relationships between records remain consistent. A foreign key can't point to a record that doesn't exist. A record can't be deleted while other records still depend on it. This sounds mundane next to HMACs and bit-flipping attacks, but think about what it prevents. An attacker, or a buggy script, deleting a customer record while leaving behind orphaned transaction records that now point to nothing, or worse, that get reassigned by some downstream process to a different customer entirely, because the application layer doesn't know how to handle a dangling reference. Referential integrity is a guarantee about the shape and consistency of data, not just its content, and it's enforced at the database engine level precisely because relying on every application that touches the database to enforce it correctly, every time, is not a bet worth making. At the code and supply chain layer, integrity means something slightly different again. Is the software you're about to run actually the software that was built and reviewed, with nothing inserted along the way? This is where hash verification of downloaded packages comes in. When you download a software package and the vendor publishes a SHA-256 hash alongside it, you're being given the means to verify independently that the bytes you received are the exact bytes the vendor produced, with nothing added, removed, or altered by a compromised mirror, a man-in-the-middle, or a corrupted download. You compute the hash of what you downloaded and compare it to the published value. If they match, you have strong assurance the file is intact. If they don't, something happened between the vendor's build process and your machine, and you should not run that file. This same principle, extended and automated, becomes the backbone of secure software development lifecycle practices. Static application security testing and software composition analysis aren't just vulnerability-finding tools. They're integrity tools in a broader sense. They verify that the code being shipped doesn't contain unauthorized modifications, known vulnerable components, or insertions that weren't part of the reviewed codebase. When a CI/CD pipeline runs SCA against every dependency before allowing a build to proceed, it's enforcing a kind of integrity guarantee over the entire supply chain. Nothing enters this build that wasn't accounted for and verified. Notice the throughline across all four of these layers. In every case, the architecture is answering the same question: is this the same as it's supposed to be? But the mechanism changes based on what the same means in that context. A cryptographic fingerprint for a wire transfer, a baseline hash for a system file, a foreign key constraint for a database relationship, a published checksum for a software package. Integrity isn't one tool. It's one question, asked repeatedly, with a different tool providing the answer depending on where in the system you're standing. Tools and the trade-offs they carry. Let's look at four of the core tools that enforce integrity, and be honest about what each one costs and what it doesn't cover, because every one of them has a blind spot, And pretending otherwise is how integrity failures sneak through systems that look, on paper, well protected. Start with hashing itself, SHA-256 and similar algorithms. What it gives you is an extraordinarily cheap, fast, and reliable way to detect any change to a piece of data, no matter how small. Computing a SHA-256 hash of a multi-gigabyte file takes seconds. What it costs you is almost nothing in computational terms. This is one of the least expensive security controls that exists. But here's the blind spot, and it's the one we already walked through. A bare hash provides no authentication. It tells you this data matches this fingerprint, but it does not tell you who produced that fingerprint, or whether the fingerprint itself can be trusted. If an attacker can modify both the data and the accompanying hash, which is trivial if the hash is just sitting next to the data in the same unprotected location, the hash provides zero protection. Hashing alone answers, has this changed since I last looked? Not can I trust what I'm looking at now. Digital signatures close that gap, but at a cost. A digital signature combines hashing with asymmetric cryptography. The sender hashes the data and then encrypts that hash with their private key. Anyone with a corresponding public key can decrypt the signature and verify it matches the hash of the data they received. This proves two things at once: that the data hasn't changed, integrity, and that it came from whoever holds that private key, which provides non-repudiation. The sender can't later credibly deny having sent it, because only their private key could have produced that signature. What it costs is significant operational overhead. You need a public key infrastructure, or at least a reliable way to distribute and trust public keys. Private keys need to be protected, because if a private key leaks, an attacker can sign data as if they were the legitimate party, and every signature that key ever produced becomes suspect. And asymmetric cryptography is computationally more expensive than symmetric hashing, which matters when you're signing high volumes of small messages. Digital signatures are the right tool when you need to prove origin as well as integrity. An outbound email that needs to prove it really came from the CFO. A software release that needs to prove it really came from the vendor. But they're overkill and operationally heavy. For something like verifying that a log file written an hour ago by your own system hasn't been tampered with since. File integrity monitoring tools give you continuous, automated assurance that critical files haven't changed outside of expected processes. The benefit is clear. If an attacker drops a malicious binary into a system directory, or modifies a configuration file to add a backdoor, or alters a startup script to establish persistence, FIM catches it, often quickly. What it costs, beyond the licensing and deployment effort, is tuning burden, and this is the blind spot that bites almost every FIM deployment at some point. Legitimate changes happen constantly: patches, configuration management runs, application updates. Every one of these will trigger a FIM alert unless the tool is told in advance to expect it. An undertuned FIM deployment generates so much noise from routine, authorized changes that analysts start ignoring its alerts, which means the one alert that represents an actual compromise gets lost in the same pile as 500 alerts about a scheduled patch cycle. FIM doesn't fail loudly when this happens. It fails quietly by becoming something nobody looks at. Database constraints, the referential integrity mechanisms we discussed, are essentially free once designed correctly. The database engine enforces them as part of normal operation. There's no separate scanning process, no additional infrastructure. What they cost is design time rigor. You have to actually model your data relationships correctly up front, and retrofitting constraints onto a database that's been running without them for years often surfaces a mountain of existing violations that have to be cleaned up before the constraint can even be enabled. And the blind spot is scope. Database constraints protect the structural relationships within the database. They say nothing about whether the values in those records are correct. A foreign key can point to a perfectly valid existing record that itself contains fraudulent or corrupted data. Referential integrity is necessary, but it's a guarantee about shape, not about truth. Across all four tools, the pattern repeats. Each one solves a real problem completely within its scope, and each one has a scope, and the moment you treat any one of them as a complete answer to "Is our data trustworthy?" you've created exactly the kind of gap that the wire transfer scenario exploited. A control that's working perfectly within its boundaries while the actual attack happens just outside them. Implementation, building the detection that actually detects. Let's work through two implementation scenarios in the kind of depth that surfaces the considerations a checklist would skip. The first is implementing file integrity monitoring on a sensitive directory. Say, a directory containing configuration files for a critical application. The naive approach is, install the FIM agent pointed at the directory, done. Here's why that's not done. The first consideration is baseline timing. When do you establish the baseline, the set of known good hashes that future states will be compared against? If you establish it on a system that's already been running for months, you're baselining whatever state the system happens to be in right now, which might already include unauthorized changes that predate the FIM deployment, in which case those changes become the new normal and will never be flagged. The correct approach is to establish the baseline as close as possible to a known good state, ideally immediately after a clean build or a verified configuration deployment, before the system has been exposed to production traffic or general access. The second consideration is what sensitive directory actually contains, because directories are rarely homogeneous. A configuration directory might contain static config files that should genuinely never change outside of a deployment, but it might also contain log files that the application writes to constantly, or cache files, or temporary files that get created and deleted as part of normal operation. If your FIM scope includes those dynamic files, you will get a continuous stream of alerts from completely benign activity. And per the tool's blind spot we just discussed, that's how real alerts get buried. So the implementation work isn't monitor the directory. It's characterize every file in the directory by its expected change pattern, and scope monitoring to the files that should be static. The third consideration is the response side, which is often left undesigned. What actually happens when FIM detects a change? If the answer is, an alert appears in a queue that gets reviewed once a day, then for a fast-moving attacker, that's not detection in any meaningful operational sense. That's a forensic record for after the fact. If the goal is genuinely to catch tampering as it happens, the alert needs a path to a human, or an automated response, on a timescale that matters. And that means FIM can't be deployed in isolation. It needs to be integrated with whatever monitoring and alerting infrastructure the organization already has, so that a FIM alert doesn't sit in its own silo, disconnected from the SIEM, disconnected from the on-call rotation. And the fourth consideration, the one that connects back to the earlier tool discussion, is change management integration. Every legitimate configuration change needs a corresponding update to the FIM baseline, ideally automatically, as part of the deployment pipeline itself. If a configuration management tool pushes an authorized change to that directory, the deployment process should update the FIM baseline for the affected files as its last step. Without this, every authorized deployment generates a FIM alert indistinguishable from an unauthorized one, and the team either has to manually clear the baseline after every deployment, which gets forgotten, or learns to expect and dismiss FIM alerts after deployments, which is exactly the habit that lets a real alert hide in the noise of a deployment window. The second implementation scenario is verifying the integrity of a downloaded software package using a published hash, which sounds almost too simple to need discussion. until you think about what the verification is actually protecting against and what it isn't. You download a package. The vendor's site also publishes a SHA-256 hash for that exact file. You compute the hash of what you downloaded. You compare it to the published value. They match. You're done, right? Here's the first thing to think through. Where did you get the published hash from? If you got it from the same web page, served over the same connection, from the same server as the download itself, and that server has been compromised such that the malicious actor has replaced both the package and the hash with their own matching pair, then your verification step verified nothing. It confirmed that the tampered file matches the tampered hash, both of which the attacker controls. The integrity check is only meaningful if the hash comes from a source that's independent of, or more trusted than, the source of the file itself, ideally published over a different channel, signed separately, or distributed through a mechanism the file's own distribution channel can't influence. The second thing to think through is what algorithm is being used. If the vendor publishes an MD5 hash, and you dutifully verify against it, you've gone through the motions of an integrity check using an algorithm with known collision vulnerabilities, meaning a sophisticated attacker could potentially construct a malicious file that produces the same MD5 hash as the legitimate one. The check would pass. The file would still be malicious. This is why the recommendation to use SHA-256 or higher isn't pedantry. It's the difference between a verification step that provides real assurance and one that provides the appearance of assurance while a known weakness sits underneath it. The third consideration, and this is the one that's almost always skipped, is automation versus habit. Manually computing and comparing a hash is something a security-conscious individual might do once, for a single critical download. It is not something an organization does consistently across every package, every dependency, every container base image, pulled by every developer every day. For integrity verification to function as an actual control rather than an occasional good intention, it has to be built into the pipeline. Package managers configured to verify checksums automatically and fail the build if they don't match. Container registries configured to reject images that don't match expected digests. Dependency scanning that checks not just for known vulnerabilities, but for unexpected changes to packages that were previously verified. The implementation isn't verify the hash. It's make verification the default behavior of the systems that pull in external code, such that a mismatch is a build failure, not a manual step someone might skip when they're in a hurry. When integrity fails, 3 diagnostic walkthroughs. This is where understanding becomes operational. Let's work through 3 failure scenarios properly, from symptom to root cause to fix, the way you'd actually have to think through them under pressure. The first scenario. A vendor publishes a hash for a software package, and the hash you compute for the file you downloaded doesn't match. The immediate reaction for many people is alarm. The file has been tampered with, supply chain compromise. That's possible, but it's not the only possibility, and jumping to that conclusion either causes unnecessary panic or, worse, causes the opposite, dismissing the mismatch as probably just a download glitch, and using the file anyway, which is the actually dangerous response. The first thing to check is whether the download completed successfully and completely. An interrupted or truncated download will produce a completely different hash than the full file, not because of tampering, but because you're hashing a different, incomplete set of bytes. Check the file size against the expected size published by the vendor. If the sizes don't match, redownload. That's very likely the explanation, and it's the most common one by a wide margin. If the file size matches but the hash still doesn't, the second thing to check is whether you're comparing against the right hash for the right version. Vendors sometimes publish multiple versions of a package for different architectures, different platforms, or different release channels, and it's surprisingly easy to download one variant while looking at the published hash for another. Verify that the hash you're comparing against corresponds exactly to the file you downloaded. Same version, same architecture, same build variant. If both of those check out, the file size is correct and you're definitely comparing against the hash for this exact file, then you're in genuinely concerning territory. And the next step is to obtain the file and the hash through a completely independent channel, a different mirror, a different network path, ideally verified against the vendor's signed release announcement rather than just the download page. If a second independent download, hashed independently, matches the vendor's published hash but your original download doesn't, the problem is localized to your original download path, possibly a compromised mirror, a malicious proxy on your network performing inspection and inadvertently or deliberately modifying content, or a man-in-the-middle. If the second independent download also produces a hash that doesn't match the vendor's published value, the investigation needs to escalate significantly, because at that point either the vendor's published hash is wrong, which does happen due to vendor error, or the vendor's distribution infrastructure itself has been compromised, which is a supply chain incident that needs to be reported and investigated at an organizational level, not resolved by an individual deciding whether to proceed with installation. The fix in the most likely case is simply redownloading from a verified source. But the diagnostic path matters because the same symptom, hash mismatch, sits on a spectrum from trivial download error to active supply chain compromise, and the correct response is completely different depending on where on that spectrum you actually are. The deeper lesson is that an integrity check that fails is information, not noise, and the investigation has to actually distinguish between the data is fine, but the comparison was flawed, and the comparison is fine, but the data isn't, because those point in opposite directions. The second scenario. Ransomware has encrypted the file shares across an organization, and when the response team goes to restore from backup, the backups are also encrypted, useless. This is, on its face, an availability disaster. The data isn't accessible. But look at it through the integrity lens and a different picture emerges, because the question, why were the backups also encrypted, is fundamentally an integrity question. It's asking, what was the relationship between the backup data and the production data? And did that relationship preserve the kind of independence that makes a backup actually function as a backup? The first thing to check is the backup architecture, specifically, were the backups stored in a location, and with permissions that made them reachable by the same compromised credentials or systems that the ransomware used to encrypt production data. If the backup repository was mounted as a writable network share, accessible to the same domain accounts that were compromised, then from the ransomware's perspective, the backups weren't a separate protected copy of the data. They were just more files on the network, equally available for encryption. The backup existed in name, but it shared a fate with the data it was supposed to protect, because nothing separated their integrity. Anything that could corrupt one could corrupt the other. The second thing to check is the backup timeline and immutability. Even if the backups themselves weren't directly encrypted by the active ransomware process, were they immutable, right? Once, in a way that prevented deletion or modification after creation. Many ransomware operations, before triggering the visible encryption payload, spend time identifying and deleting or corrupting backup repositories specifically, because attackers know that organizations with intact backups can often refuse to pay and simply restore. If the backup system allowed deletion or overwriting of historical backups by an account that the attacker compromised, the backups could have been destroyed well before the visible attack, and the ransomware encrypted the backups. Framing might actually be, the attacker had already removed the backups, and the encryption event is just when the organization noticed. The fix that emerges from this diagnostic isn't get better backup software. It's architectural, and it's fundamentally about integrity isolation. Backups need to be stored in a way that's logically and ideally physically separate from the production environment, using separate credentials that aren't part of the same authentication domain as production systems, so that a compromise of production credentials doesn't automatically grant access to backup infrastructure. And backups need immutability guarantees, write-once storage, retention locks, something that means even an attacker with legitimate-looking credentials to the backup system cannot delete or modify backups that have already been written, only create new ones. The deeper lesson here is that, do we have backups, is the wrong question. The right question is, do our backups have an integrity relationship with production that's independent enough that whatever compromises production cannot also compromise them? And that's a question about architecture and access boundaries, not about whether a backup job ran successfully last night. The third scenario. A database reports a checksum mismatch on a critical record. Many database systems maintain internal checksums on stored pages or records specifically to detect storage-level corruption, independent of any application-level integrity controls. When one of these fires, the immediate question is whether this represents tampering, hardware failure, or a software bug, and those three causes point toward very different remediation paths, so the diagnostic has to narrow this down before acting. The first thing to check is scope and pattern. Is this a single record on a single page on a single system? Or is it part of a pattern affecting multiple records, multiple pages, possibly across multiple systems that share underlying storage infrastructure? A single, isolated checksum failure, with no similar failures nearby in time or location, leans toward a localized hardware issue, a bad sector, a memory error during a write, the kind of random, low-probability corruption that happens occasionally in any large storage system simply due to physical hardware imperfection. A pattern of failures, especially one that correlates with a specific time window, a specific user, a specific application process, or a specific underlying storage volume, points away from random hardware noise and toward something systemic, either a bug in a process that writes to that storage, or, in the more concerning case, deliberate modification. The second thing to check, if the pattern doesn't immediately point to isolated hardware failure, is what else happened around the same time on the same system. This means correlating with access logs. What accounts accessed this record or this storage volume around the time the corruption would have occurred with deployment logs? Was there a software update or migration script that touched this data? And with any other integrity signals available, did FIM, if deployed on the underlying storage, flag anything during that window? The goal is to build a timeline that either turns up a benign explanation, a known migration script that had a bug and has since been fixed, or surfaces unauthorized access that coincides with the corruption. The third thing to check, and this is the step that's easy to skip under pressure to just fix it and move on, is whether this record has dependents, other records that reference it, calculations or reports that were generated using its value before the corruption was detected. A checksum mismatch tells you this record is wrong now. It doesn't tell you when it became wrong, which means anything that used this record's value between whenever the corruption actually occurred and whenever it was detected may have propagated an incorrect value further into the system. Reports generated, downstream records calculated, decisions made based on data that, in retrospect, wasn't trustworthy. The fix depends on which of the three causes the investigation points to. For isolated hardware corruption with no suspicious pattern, the fix is restoring the affected record from a known good backup and potentially flagging the underlying storage hardware for inspection or replacement. For a software bug, the fix is identifying and correcting the process that introduced the corruption, restoring affected records, and critically, identifying every other record that process touched during the period it was buggy. because if it corrupted this one record, it likely corrupted others that haven't triggered a checksum alert yet. Perhaps because the corruption it introduces doesn't always change the checksum in a way that gets flagged. For deliberate tampering, this becomes an incident, full investigation, scoping of what else the responsible account or process accessed, and a response that goes well beyond restoring a single record. The through line across all three of these scenarios is the same. A failed integrity check is a starting point for an investigation, not an endpoint with an obvious fix attached. The same symptom can sit at almost any point on a spectrum from routine and explainable to active and serious. And the diagnostic work is what determines where on that spectrum you actually are, which is exactly the kind of judgment that separates someone who can recite what integrity means from someone who can actually operate in an environment where integrity has just been called into question. The role-based lens, three different relationships with the same question. The question, is this data trustworthy, looks completely different depending on when in the data's life cycle you're standing, and three roles experience it at genuinely different moments. The security architect encounters integrity at design time before any data exists, when the question is, what integrity guarantees does this system need, and what's the mechanism that provides them? When a new payment processing feature is being designed, the architect isn't reacting to a tampering event. They're anticipating one, asking what would happen if an attacker could modify a value mid-transaction, and working backward from that question to decide where HMACs are needed. What gets digitally signed versus simply hashed, where database constraints need to enforce relationships that the application layer might otherwise get wrong, and crucially, how the keys and secrets that those integrity mechanisms depend on get generated, distributed, and rotated. The architect's relationship with integrity is fundamentally about anticipation, building the tripwires before there's any indication they'll ever be needed, and making the case, often to stakeholders focused on functionality and timelines, for why a feature that encrypts everything still needs a separate mechanism to detect tampering, because the architect is the one person in the room who's thinking about the bit-flipping attack on a feature that hasn't shipped yet. The security data engineer encounters integrity at the pipeline level continuously as an operational property of a system that's already running. Their relationship with integrity isn't design it in. It's keep it true every hour across every run. When a daily roll-up report generation pipeline runs, the engineer's concern is whether the output accurately represents the input, whether a parsing change, a schema drift in an upstream log source, a race condition between parallel pipeline stages, or a silent failure in an intermediate processing step could produce a report that looks complete and correctly formatted while actually representing corrupted or incomplete data. This is the scenario where a dashboard suddenly shows 0 sessions for the current day despite raw logs containing events. The data engineer's job is to recognize that the dashboard shows 0, and the data has integrity are two completely different claims, and the gap between them, somewhere in parsing, aggregation, or serving, is exactly where their attention needs to go. Hardening a pipeline against malformed JSON output, against race conditions that cause one process to overwrite another's output mid-write, against silent truncation. These are all integrity work, even though none of them involve an attacker, because the engineer's relationship with integrity is about a system that processes data continuously and must be trusted to represent that data faithfully every single time, with no human reviewing each run. The SOC analyst at L2 or L3 encounters integrity reactively, after something has already happened, when the question is what changed, and was that change authorized? When an alert fires indicating that a critical file has been modified, or that a database record's checksum doesn't match, the analyst's relationship with integrity is investigative and time-pressured. They're working backward from a detected change to determine its cause and its blast radius. This is fundamentally different from the architect's anticipatory stance and the data engineer's continuous operational stance. The analyst is looking at evidence that an integrity boundary was crossed, and their job is to reconstruct what happened, whether it was authorized, what else might have been affected, and whether containment action is needed right now. The analyst's tools are the artifacts that integrity controls produce when they fire: the FIM alert, the checksum mismatch, the HMAC verification failure, and their skill is in the diagnostic process we walked through earlier, distinguishing the benign explanation from the serious one under time pressure with incomplete information. What makes these three roles genuinely different, rather than three descriptions of the same job, is the relationship to time. The architect is before the fact, designing for a violation that hasn't happened and might never happen. The data engineer is during the fact, maintaining integrity as a continuous property of a running system, where the data was fine an hour ago provides no guarantee about right now. The analyst is after the fact, investigating a violation that has already been detected, where the central question is reconstruction, not prevention. Integrity, as a concern, follows data through its entire life cycle, and each of these roles owns a different segment of that life cycle. Capstone scenario: the hospital records migration. You are the security architect for a regional hospital network that is migrating its patient records system from an aging on-premises database to a modern cloud-hosted platform. The migration involves moving 12 years of patient history, lab results, medication records, and clinical notes, tens of millions of records, from a legacy system that has been patched and modified by at least 4 different vendors over its lifetime, into a new system with a cleaner, more rigorously constrained schema. The constraint that defines this entire scenario is this: the migration cannot pause clinical operations, and it cannot risk a single patient record arriving at the new system with an altered value. Because in this context, altered value doesn't mean a financial loss, it means a medication dosage, an allergy flag, a lab result that a clinician will read and act on. A wrong dosage value isn't a data quality issue here. It's a patient safety issue. The hospital's leadership has made clear that the migration timeline is flexible. The integrity of the migrated data is not. You begin by recognizing that this is, fundamentally, an integrity problem at a scale, and with stakes that most integrity controls aren't designed for. The legacy system's data wasn't built with cryptographic integrity in mind. There are no HMACs on historical records, no signatures, nothing that lets you prove, after the fact, that a record retrieved from the legacy system today is the same as it was when it was originally written, possibly a decade ago. You're not verifying integrity that was designed in. You're establishing integrity at the moment of migration for data that has none, and then carrying that guarantee forward. The first decision is how to verify that data extracted from the legacy system matches data loaded into the new system. Given that the schemas aren't identical, the new system has stricter referential integrity constraints, normalized fields, and data types that don't map one-to-one onto the legacy system's looser structure. A simple hash comparison between source and destination won't work directly, because the data is being transformed during migration. A hash of the source record and a hash of the transformed destination record will legitimately differ. That's not a problem. That's the migration doing its job. So you design a two-stage verification. The first stage hashes the source data before any transformation, record by record, and stores those hashes alongside an immutable append-only migration log. This log itself needs integrity protection, because it's the only record of what the source data actually was, once the legacy system is eventually decommissioned. The second stage applies the transformation logic in a staging environment. then runs a reconciliation process that doesn't compare raw hashes, but instead rederives from the transformed record the values that should map back to the original fields, and verifies those derived values against the original hashed source data. If a patient's medication record had a dosage of 50 milligrams in the legacy system, the reconciliation process confirms that the transformed record, however its schema differs, still resolves to 50 milligrams when you trace that field through the transformation logic, not 5, not 500, not a null where a value should be. The second decision involves the database constraints in the new system, and here you face the first real trade-off. The new schema's stricter referential integrity, foreign keys that must resolve required fields that can't be null, is exactly what you want long-term. It's a structural integrity improvement over the legacy system's looser model. But the legacy data, accumulated over 12 years across 4 vendors' worth of modifications, contains records that violate these constraints. A lab result that references a physician ID that no longer exists in the physician table, because that physician left the practice 8 years ago, and the legacy system never enforced the relationship. A patient record with a missing required field that the legacy system allowed to be blank. You cannot simply enable the constraints and let the migration fail on every violation. That would halt the migration on thousands of historical edge cases, most of which represent old, closed, completed episodes of care that nobody is actively working with, but every one of which still represents a real patient's real medical history that the hospital is legally obligated to retain, and that a clinician might need to retrieve someday. You also cannot simply disable the constraints for migrated data and enable them only for new records going forward, because that creates 2 classes of data in the same system, one with integrity guarantees and one without. And over time, nobody will remember which records fall into which category. The distinction will be lost, and you'll have quietly recreated the legacy system's integrity gaps inside the new one, just less visibly. The decision you make is to migrate historical data into the new system within a clearly demarcated legacy partition that has relaxed constraints, but every record in that partition carries an explicit, queryable flag indicating it predates the integrity enforcement boundary, along with a reference to its entry in the immutable migration log, so that if a clinician ever retrieves one of these records and the system shows a referential gap, a lab result pointing to a physician record that doesn't exist, that gap is visible and explained, rather than silently tolerated as if it were normal. New records, created after the migration, are subject to the full constraint set from day one, no exceptions, no relaxed partition. This is a documented risk acceptance. The hospital accepts that a defined set of historical records carry known integrity gaps inherited from the legacy system. Those gaps are cataloged. They're flagged in the new system rather than hidden, and they do not propagate forward because the constraint boundary is absolute for everything created after the cutover. The third decision concerns the migration window itself. Clinical operations cannot pause, which means patient records are being created and modified in the legacy system during the entire migration period. The data is a moving target. You implement the migration in batches, by date range, oldest records first. And for each batch, after migration and reconciliation are complete and verified, that batch is marked read-only in the legacy system. Clinicians can still view it there if needed during the transition, but no further rights are permitted to migrated records. All new activity for those patients is directed to the new system. This means, for a period of weeks, the hospital is operating 2 systems simultaneously, with a hard, auditable line by record by date of which system is authoritative for which data. And that line itself becomes part of the integrity story. Every record can answer the question, which system was the source of truth for this record, and when did that change? The outcome, 12 weeks later, is a completed migration where every migrated record has a documented chain from its original hash in the legacy system, through the transformation and reconciliation process, to its final form in the new system, where every known integrity gap inherited from the legacy data is cataloged and flagged rather than silently present, where new data created from day one onward is subject to the full constraint set the new schema was designed to provide, and where the migration log itself, the record of what the source data actually was, is preserved as an immutable artifact, because the hospital's leadership understood that even after the migration is done, there will be questions, audits, possibly legal discovery requests, years from now that ask, prove that this record as it exists today is what it was when it was created. And the answer to that question has to exist, documented, the day the migration completes, because it cannot be reconstructed afterward. Closing, the discipline of asking, is this still true? If there's one posture to carry forward from everything we've covered, it's this. Encryption answers, can someone read this? And that is a different question from, is this still what it was? And the moment those two questions get treated as the same question, a gap opens that nothing is watching. Integrity isn't a feature you add. It's a question you keep asking at every point where data moves, rests, transforms, or gets relied upon. And the tools we've discussed, hashing, HMACs, digital signatures, FIM, database constraints, are simply the different shapes that question takes depending on where you're standing. A hash asks the question for a static file. An HMAC asks it for data crossing an untrusted channel, with a secret that an attacker can't forge. FIM asks it continuously for files that should never quietly change. A constraint asks it structurally for relationships between records that must remain coherent. What ties all of it together is the recognition that detection is often the whole job. You don't always get to prevent tampering. The bit-flipping attacker in the wire transfer scenario succeeded in flipping the bits. Nothing stopped that. What integrity controls provide is the certainty that the tampering didn't go unnoticed, that the $900 transaction got rejected before it became real money, that the modified configuration file triggered an alert before the backdoor became persistent, that the corrupted database record was caught before its bad value propagated into a dozen downstream reports. Carry forward the habit of asking for every system you touch, every pipeline you build, every architecture you review. If something here changed unexpectedly right now, accidentally or deliberately, would anything notice? And if the honest answer is not really, not until someone happens to look, that's not a gap in your monitoring. That's a gap in your integrity. And it's the kind of gap that doesn't announce itself until the day something walks through it. End of session, mental model. Integrity, data you can trust.